Okay.
Yes,
that's right. Yes, that's fine. That's fine. Okay. Yeah. I probably won't say all the things that are there, but yeah, that's fine. I don't mind. Some of it's very notey. So, okay. So, shall I start? Okay. E ngā mana, e ngā reo, e ngā hau e wha, tēnā koutou, tēnā tātou katoa. That's a greeting from New Zealand in the Māori language, which it says, respecting everybody in the room, the languages you bring, the perspectives you bring, welcome. And it's relevant, more relevant in New Zealand. This is the way we start everything. New Zealand is right at the other side of the world, and is about 3 hours flight southeast of Australia. And I know some of you've been there, but I know some of you may not have. So just to locate myself geographically, I'm currently working at the University of Cardiff, which has meant that I've been able to come today, which is fantastic. As normally this is too far for me to come for a short conference. I want to start by acknowledging my co-author, Darren Joseph, who couldn't come. But he and I worked together on this paper, and it's certainly a joint paper. So I hope I do Darren's knowledge justice. Today I'm going to be talking about a book called How My Koro Became a Star. And koro means grandfather, how my grandfather became a star. And Darren and I wanted to look at this book because it exists in English and in Māori, and it's quite common in New Zealand for picture books to be published in 2 separate editions, one in English and one in Māori. There's a Māori medium school system that goes from kindergarten through primary, secondary, right through to university, that sits alongside the English medium system, and so both systems need access to literature, and so that's why books are being published in both languages. We're interested in looking at how the fact and the fiction in this dual version, Matariki picture book, and I'll tell you a little bit more about Matariki in a minute, how fact and fiction are woven together. And it harks back actually to some of the talks we had today, at the beginning of today, where we were talking about whose knowledge is being reproduced when you have facts in books, and who decides what knowledge is. This book reflects a whole lot of what we call mātauranga Māori, which is Māori knowledge, Māori science, which is different to Western science and knowledge. So it's an interesting one to think about in terms of those ideas. Darren wanted to start by acknowledging the recipients of the Te Kahurangi Katarina Te Hei Koko Mataira Award in New Zealand. The author with a star under her name is the author of today's book. But this is an award that is given to manuscripts that are written in Te Reo Māori, to encourage them to be published. And Darren is one of the judges for that. So he wanted to acknowledge that this is actually, the existence of this book has come through an award that helps Indigenous voices grow in children's literature. Before I tell you more about the book, I want to kind of give you some more fact before the fiction, if you like. And first of all, acknowledge Professor Rangi Matamua, who is an advocate for Mātauranga Māori. I mentioned that word before, particularly the revitalisation of Māori astronomy. And the basis of his writings are from the works of his ancestors in Māori astronomy. And he is, one of the things he's most famous for is, aside from reviving the celebration of a Māori New Year celebration called Matariki, which is now a public holiday in New Zealand, he has also reclaimed the hautapu ritual, which is a ritual where food is cooked and the steam from the food escapes from the pot and takes people who've died from the previous years up into the stars. So there's some of the fact behind this book, and there's some more, and this is about the author, Brianne Te Pā, who's a deputy principal at Kaipara School, which is in the north of the North Island of New Zealand. This is her first book, the book we're talking about today. it came about because she attended a workshop with Professor Matamua, who was on the previous slide. And when she got home, she wrote this book about summarizing the knowledge that Rangi gave her during the course. So here you see already the fact and the fiction beginning to weave. She used the fact from the workshop and wove it into a story. Tell you a little bit more about Matariki, which Rangi Matamua is so famous for reviving. In 2022, we celebrated the first national holiday linked to Te Ao Māori, or the Māori world. It's about the Māori New Year, which is signalled by the appearance of the star cluster Pleiades, which occurs all over the world, when it's called Matariki. That constellation is called Matariki in New Zealand. And when it appears, it's the start of the Māori New Year. So in the middle of, feels like the middle of winter, but of course it's tending towards the start of spring. When Matariki comes into the sky, we have a national public holiday, and it changes its date every year depending on what the stars are doing. It's a time for planting food, for sharing food with family and friends, and for remembering those who've died. And just one last bit of context before I tell you more about fiction is the Te Tiriti o Waitangi. So New Zealand is a country that was colonised by settlers from the UK, from England. And in 1840, some of the Māori chiefs and the Queen of England at the time, Victoria, signed a treaty called Te Tiriti o Waitangi, or the Treaty of Waitangi, called Waitangi because that's the name of the place where it was signed. And under that treaty, all Māori rituals and rites would be respected, including things like Matariki and Te Reo Māori, the Māori language. It took until 1987 for Māori to be made an official language. For a long time, the treaty wasn't honoured in any way. It was just completely forgotten. But due to a lot of really amazing people who agitated, it eventually was recognised, and slowly these rights are being honoured. There's some resistance from the older generation to the use of Te Reo Māori, but in the younger generations, there's real embracing of both the language and the knowledge behind it. And the work of picture books contributes to this. And a lot of my work now is about looking at how picture books reflect Indigenous Māori knowledge and contribute to wider society's understanding of Mātauranga Māori, and Māori knowledge, and also Te Reo Māori, the Māori language. So since Matariki became a national holiday, there's just been quite an explosion of picture books being written. The one in the top left corner there, Matariki by Gavin Bishop, is one of the most recent of these books, a lovely little board book that talks about the different stars in the cluster. It's interesting though, I've done some other presentations where I've kind of looked at the timing of all of these books, and in fact picture books about Matariki predated it becoming a national holiday. I like to think of picture books as leading the way here. And in fact they do a lot of work because they go into homes and they're read by the parents to the children, and so you have two audiences learning at the same time, and I think that's very powerful. Yes, here's not all of them. Here's some of the books that have been published about Matariki, but this is the one we're focusing on. And you can see that the Māori language version on the left has a slightly different cover to the English version on the right. Kua whetū rangitia a koro, how my koro became a star. The Māori title is more like the becoming of a star by my koro, or something like that, but they're very similar. The inside of the books is identical in terms of layout and illustration, but the covers, this was published in 2022 by Huia, which is an Indigenous publisher of children and adults books, and their house style now is to differentiate the covers of the two versions. So a little bit of, there isn't a whole lot of research about Indigenous picture books, although I think somebody in the room who has done some, yes, Ruth, who I met at lunch. And really this is an area where I'm focusing most of my work now, and working alongside Indigenous colleagues to learn more about what's happening in Indigenous children's literature. using often a critical multiculturalism lens to where you're looking at the idea that the dominant culture doesn't impose ideas on how to represent another culture. Instead, there's a sharing of power. And this is particularly relevant for this book because this is a book that's published by a Māori publisher, written by a Māori author, illustrated by a Māori illustrator. So this is a Māori voice. This is definitely not having another culture imposed upon it. The main points that as Darren and I looked through both versions of the books, we were looking for how Mātauranga Māori or Māori knowledge was being represented, but also to see if there were any differences between the two versions, the English version and the Māori version. And the translation, here's some of the key points that the translation reveals different ways of learning in the two cultures. There's different ways of representing Māori astronomy. There's a focus on intergenerational transmission or intergenerational learning, and the notion of this book being set before Matariki became a national holiday, and the whole notion of us being on the cusp of Matariki being ingrained into the national psyche of New Zealand. It's only happened twice, but it seems that society has really embraced it. So looking in on the translation, in English, the text says, the he in this text is koro, the grandfather. He taught me about Matariki. And in the Māori version, it says, e korero a koro mō Matariki. So in English, the verse, the taught word implies this kind of one-directional thing going on. In the Māori version, it's about storytelling, not directly teaching anything. It's just koro told me a story. And you see in the illustration there that Koro and Tama were by the fire, under the stars, having a chat. So there's no classroom situation. There's no, one person dominant over the other. They're having a chat, and this is a Māori understanding of what education is. Reflects Māori pedagogy and not an active kind of much more Western style of intentional and still intentional, I guess, but just not so formal. Yes, formal. Thank you very much. Thank you. The idea of Māori astronomy, the fact of Māori astronomy is woven into this story all the way through. And this image shows you a particularly important part of the story, which is the idea that there's a waka or a canoe that takes all the souls who've passed into the sky, and they become stars. So this is very much in both of the versions of the story. Then the idea again in both of the versions of the story of this idea of intergenerational transmission. Traditional Māori pedagogy is about the older generation passing something on to the newer generation. And there's also something about often in traditional child rearing, a child is given to grandparents to rear so that knowledge is passed on to a chosen one. And in this particular family, there are 4 children in the family, but only the youngest boy is the one who Koro, the grandfather, tells him about this knowledge about Matariki. So this idea of intergenerational transmission between a grandparent and a grandchild, and a particular grandchild, is evident, and the fact of that is woven into the fiction of this story. And Darren wanted to point out that in statistics that are gathered in New Zealand, 65% of Māori youth in a Growing Up New Zealand longitudinal study stated they relied on their grandparents. So I've got some D there. So this idea of a special relationship between a grandparent generation and a grandchild generation is very much a part of Māori society, and so it's again this fact that's reflected in the fiction of the story. And lastly, this idea of nation building. Darren took both of these pictures in our last celebration of Matariki, which was July, I think it was July the 14th this year, the same day as Bastille Day, just by accident. And just all around the shops, there are displays of books about Matariki. Even this is an outdoor shop, the Backdoor Place, that is talking about Manawatia Matariki. That means let's celebrate Matariki. Now, this is everywhere. It's embedded into the selling culture, if you like, of the country, and it's so the story that's in the book is a fact that's kind of being embedded into the story of the national psyche, if you like, very quickly. And we think that children's literature plays a really important part in that. This picture book, The Dominant Culture, isn't imposing ideas on how to represent another culture. As I mentioned before, this is a wholly Maori story. And it's not a story of Māori living in the past, an old-fashioned traditional society. This is contemporary Māori living as Māori using traditional knowledge in this story. So the fact is woven into the fiction of the story in many ways. Brianne Tupar listened to a seminar, and then she penned, actually she called it a poem to start with, and the text of picture books is often quite poetic. Mātauranga Māori is embedded into the fictional characters and what happens in the story, where a grandfather tells his grandson about Matariki, then he dies, and the grandson has to go and tell the rest of his family what needs to happen for the soul of his grandfather to be taken up into the stars, because he's got that knowledge now. There's this fact of intergenerational transmission that's woven into the fiction of the story, and there's a contribution to a new reality that's part of New Zealand society, wider New Zealand society, and nation building. Nō reira, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā tātou katoa.